Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure and proud privilege to be introducing to you this extraordinarily distinguished panel. Before I go, let me tell you a little bit of the context of this in which this is happening. We're holding here at the Azim Premji University, hosted by the Azim Premji University, something called an Advanced Graduate Workshop. This will be the sixth such workshop held. Started by Professor Stiglitz. It used to be held jointly at Columbia University and Manchester University at Manchester University. We decided the center of the world has now shifted away from Manchester. It's now Bangalore. So we decided to move it, and very kindly the Azim Premji University is hosting it, and the Institute of New Economic Thinking in the US has co-sponsored this event. So that's the background. We have 25 of the best and brightest PhD students from across the world coming here, including, of course, several Indian students, some of them universities abroad, some of them here. And, the Azim Premji University, which, as you may well know, is the kind of, one of the rising stars of Bangalore, amongst many rising stars. And the Vice Chancellor, Anurag Behar, will say a few words before I introduce the panel to you. The format of this, let me add, is that each of these speakers, the three panelists, Professors Stiglitz, Kanbur, and Wade, will speak for about 15-20 minutes each. Then they'll have a conversation amongst them, comment on each other's work, and then we'll open it to questions from the audience. So first of all, my privilege and pleasure to invite Anurag Behar, the Vice Chancellor of Azim Premji University, to say a few words.
It's my proud privilege to invite Akbar here, and of course to all of you. What I'm going to do is just a very brief introduction to the Azim Premji University, and also to this issue as to why do we think that these things are important? Why do we hold the public lecture series, and why do we hold public lecture series around these kind of issues? Well, the Azim Premji University is a very young university. It was established 2 years ago by the Azim Premji Foundation. The university was established by the foundation with a very specific purpose. And the purpose was to contribute to the field of education. When I say education here, I mean school education and other areas of human development. And to do that by conducting research and offering programs, postgraduate programs and undergraduate programs, which are focused specifically on education and other areas of human development. Now that's sort of the activity of the Azim Premji University, right? We're a very small university today, just offering 2 master's programs, one in education and the other in development, with about 240 master's students. We are scaling up rapidly. Hopefully we're going to have about 3,500, 4,000 students over the next 4 years. However, what's more important is what is the purpose of this university? And the purpose of this university, as we see it, is to make direct contribution to a more just, a more equitable, a more humane society in our country. And to do that by hopefully working with a very large student population, both here in the Bangalore campus and eventually, hopefully, across the country through our many foundation campuses, by offering programs in those areas and conducting research. We started this university because we felt there was a tremendous need for human capacity in these areas. We also conceptualized this university as not an ivory tower sitting here in Bangalore, but as an integrated place of learning, along with the field work that the foundation does across the country. And the foundation, by the way, is engaged entirely on improving equity and quality of the public education school system, the government schooling system. This entire organization, this entire foundation, including the university, as I said, is bothered about creating a just, equitable, and humane society. And as that concern is the overriding concern for us, we felt that it's important for a city like Bangalore to actually bring these issues up again and again, to discuss this. And when we have the privilege of people like Professor Stiglitz, Professor Kanbur, and Professor Wade being here, we thought it was a wonderful opportunity to have a discussion amongst them and hopefully with you as well. So welcome, and I'm sure we're going to enjoy this session. Akbar, thank you so much.
My terrible manners, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Akbar Nauman, and I work at Columbia University at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, a think tank set up by Joe Stiglitz, which is sort of partly organizing this event, obviously. Now, if I were to do justice to our distinguished panelists in introducing them, I would take up the whole 2 hours. There's so much to say, so I'll be very, very brief, and they're all very well known to you. Joe Stiglitz, of course, you know about his Nobel Prize and all of that, and his very distinguished career as an academic, and of course the Nobel Prize itself attests to that, and is chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton, chief economist of the World Bank, and he publishes very regularly and widely, including recently sort of books which are accessible to a more general audience than professional economists. His latest book is The Price of Inequality on the US, which I think he may mention in his talk. Anyway, as I said, then Professor Ravi Kanbur will speak after him, a son of Bangalore, of Karnataka at least, and he grew up in these parts, and so very distinguished, one of the earliest and most notable exports of Karnataka to the US. And it's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with Ravi, who's made major contributions to the field of development economics, and also worked at the World Bank, both in the research side and the chief economist side, and very much as in the operational front of the World Bank as a director. Now, of course, he knows Karnataka extremely well. What Robert Wade will be followed by, he goes back, this is one of his books called The Village Republics, which was research he conducted here near Karnataka in Andhra in the late 70s and early 80s. But also he published a very, very interesting piece of work, which although he's known for many things, I think that's slightly got a little bit forgotten in his many works, which is a comparison of irrigation bureaucracies in India and Korea. Fascinating exercise. I should mention, of course, that Robert did his work 70s. When Joe Stiglitz is a long-standing connection with India. First, he was a PhD student together with a fellow student, Mrinal Datta Chaudhary. There were 2 stars, and then Mrinal Datta Chaudhary, when he was professor at Delhi School, invited Joe to come to India for the first time. That was in 1967, the year of that famous or infamous devaluation of the rupee. And of course, India has come a very long way since then. Of course, and he's been coming here regularly to India, at least once or twice a year, actually, in the last few years. So he's been keeping a close tab on what is happening to the Indian economy. Anyway, without very further ado, they will, as I said, they'll all speak for about 15, 20 minutes, and then they'll have an exchange amongst themselves, and then we'll open to questions. Joe, would you like to just sit there and speak, or do you want to come here, as you wish?
Real pleasure to be here. What I'm going to do this evening is talk mostly about my new book, which Akbar referred to, The Price of Inequality, and some of the themes that I raised there, which are, I think, very relevant for some of the discussions, debates going on in India. The book itself began out of an article I wrote for Vanity Fair. And as you might gather, Vanity Fair is not the usual place for publishing by academics. But one of my first articles I published on inequality was published in Econometrica. And I have to say, the Vanity Fair article got a lot bigger readership than the article that I published in Econometrica. The title of the article in Vanity Fair was of the 1%, for the 1%, and by the 1%. And in a way, the title says a lot of what the content of that article and what I'm going to talk about. It was, as I say, focused on the United States, the extent to which inequality has increased there. And the major theme that I'm going to try to emphasize today is that the extent to which inequality has grown in the United States and many other countries, and the way in which it's been created is actually bad for the economy. Economists used to talk about the notion that there was a trade-off. You could have more growth or more equality. But if you wanted more equality, you would have to give up on growth. And the big message that I'd like to get across is that, in fact, the way and the extent, the way inequality has been created and the extent of inequality means that today in the United States, and I think in most other countries, we could have both more growth if we had more equality, so that actually growth, the equality becomes part of the growth agenda. Let me begin by a brief description of the extent to which inequality has grown in the United States. And it really has increased very markedly in the last 30 years, to the point now where the upper 1%, which is a chant was taken up by the Occupy Wall Street, the 99% and 1%, the upper 1% gets about between 20 and 25% of all the nation's income, and about a third of all the wealth. And in the crisis, economic crisis, things got much worse. So that, for instance, in the year after the crisis, 2010, 93% of all the growth in the United States went to the upper 1%. It'd be one thing if the growth at the top was led to an increase in well-being of everybody. That idea that don't worry about inequality, just focus on how well everybody is doing, has been a big refrain, particularly in the right. Mitt Romney, who is going quickly into history, but was in the center of American stage not that long ago, said at one point that, oh, this discussion of inequality is all the politics of envy. And what I'm talking about is not the politics of envy. He went on to say you shouldn't even talk about inequality. You should only talk about inequality in closed rooms, in quiet voices. Don't stir up any problem. I understand why he had that view, but the point is that the growth at the top has not trickled down to the rest of our society, so that today people in the middle, the median income, half above, half below, of Americans are lower than it was in 1996, a decade and a half ago. So all the growth in the last decade and a half has gone to the top. Most Americans are worse off than they were 15 years ago. For men, a significant fraction of our population, for men, things are even worse. The median income, again, half above, half below, median income of a full-time male worker in the United States is lower than it was in 1968, when I first came, just about the time I first came to India, almost 5 decades ago. This is really, really astounding kind of growth in inequality. And then it gets reflected in every dimension, in health, the longevity of the people, the huge disparities in longevity, and at the bottom, longevity is actually decreasing, even though on average longevity is increasing. One aspect of the inequality in the United States that's particularly disturbing is that what's been happening to the nature of inequality of opportunity. And the United States is both the country among the advanced industrial countries with the highest level of inequality, but also the least equality of opportunity. And that's very striking because most people think of America as a land of opportunity. And what is true is that some people do go from the bottom to the middle, the bottom to the top. It's so unusual that newspapers write about it. You don't write newspaper stories about dogs that bite people, but you do write stories about people that bite dogs. And the incidence, the likelihood of somebody making it from the bottom to the top in the United States is lower than in any of the other advanced industrial countries. You following? So the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the young education and income of his parents than in these other countries, and markedly lower than in Scandinavia. Again, it would be one thing if a lot of the inequality that existed was a result of individuals making contributions to our society that really transformed society. But if you look at the people at the top of the list of the wealthiest people, they don't include any of the great scientists that have transformed our society. Not people like Watson and Crick that did DNA, not the people who created the internet or the web, not the people that transistor or laser. These are not the people who are at the top. And there's an important lesson. If you look at the people at the top, it's disproportionately people from the financial sector, people from who have monopoly. A couple of the richest people are in the category of monopolists. They may have made a contribution. Some of them have, some of them questionably. But what is clear is that much of their much of their income is due to monopoly. People have taken advantage of deficiencies in corporate governance to seize for themselves a large fraction of the corporate revenues. So if we look at who has made it to the top, it isn't the image that we'd like to have that it's people who really made large contributions. And that brings me to two of the important points I wanted to emphasize. First, I said that the United States has more inequality and less equality of opportunity than other countries. That's important to realize because market forces are operating, say, on both sides of the Atlantic, in old Europe, in the United States, both sides of the Pacific, and yet, if it were just market forces, you'd expect the market forces to be roughly the same in all countries, and what would be going on in all countries would be the same, but it's not. The fact that that market forces don't exist in a vacuum, they're shaped by our laws and regulations, and they're shaped in ways in which the United States and in some other countries lead to a lot of inequality. In other countries, like Scandinavia, lead to less inequality. In some countries, there's less equality of opportunity, like the United States. In other countries, like Scandinavia, there's more equality of opportunity. So our legal frameworks shape those. Let me just give you a couple of examples of how our legal frameworks shape that. One of them has to do, obviously, with the extent to which you enforce antitrust competition laws. Because if you have monopolies and you don't stop those monopolies, you're going to get large monopoly rents. That's one example. But another one, a simple one, is one that might not seem so obvious, is bankruptcy law. Bankruptcy law deals with what happens when you can't pay the debts that you owe. You ask the question, and the question then is who gets paid first? And in the United States, we changed the law that said that the people who get first claim when a company goes bankrupt are derivatives, CDSs. Those risky products, remember, that brought down AIG and caused the United States government to give a $180 billion bailout to one company? And that's a lot of money, even for a rich country. So the U.S. government implicitly, in its bankruptcy law, was encouraging those derivatives by saying, don't worry, if you take big risks, you'll get paid first. And then, of course, everybody understood, if the other parties couldn't pay, the U.S. government would come to the rescue. So that's one example. At the other extreme, if you're a student and you have an education system like the United States where you have to pay large amounts of money to go to school and your parents can't afford it, you have to borrow, student loans cannot be discharged even in bankruptcy. So it's a noose around your neck for the rest of your life. And these stories, when I was going around talking about my book, that I encountered in various places with what the student loans were doing was just horrendous. It was one of the most, the saddest, the most stories that I've heard. For instance, a parent had made a mistake of co-signing a loan of their child. You would think, well, that's what parents do. They co-sign the loan. But then the child gets killed. The parent still has to pay back the debt. And if the parent goes bankrupt, he still cannot charge the debt. It's, as I say, a noose around the parent's neck for the rest of his life. And he becomes essentially an indentured servant to the bank. 25% of his income can be taken by the bank every year for the rest of his life. So this is the kind of economics, with the way in which the rules and regulations structure the economy, affect opportunity, affect inequality. The second major lesson that comes out of the stories that I've just told is that not only is inequality the result of how we run our politics, our legal framework. It's a matter of politics, not a matter of choice, not just of market forces. The implication of that is that there is inevitably going to be a nexus between economics and politics. And this is really one of the major concerns in the United States and in many other countries. As you get more economic inequality, and they get to the magnitude of inequality that there is in the United States, that inequality starts getting exercised, gets reflected in inequality of political power. And that's especially true if you have poorly designed political systems. So in the United States, campaign contributions are very important. I don't know if you followed. The last election is estimated to cost more than $2 billion. And the candidates had to raise the money. And they're not going to raise the money from, in general, poor people. The people who have money to give to finance campaigns that are costing $1 billion or more are people at the top. And when they make those contributions, for a large extent, not always, but to a large extent, they make them not as charitable contributions, but as investments. And investments which they expect to get a return. And the banks have gotten a high return. In fact, they've gotten a higher return for their investments in politics in Washington than they did in their investments in financial assets. Those were disaster. But their political investments worked wonders. So this nexus between economics and politics becomes then an important part of the way societies shape inequality. Well, I want to come finally to a discussion of the consequences of that, because I think that's in some ways the most important. The consequences, as I suggested in the beginning, are that inequality actually weakens the economy. It also undermines democracy, it divides our society. But I want to focus for a moment now on how it weakens the economy. And there are actually 4 mechanisms by which it does this. The first is almost a corollary of what I've already said. If a lot of the inequality is associated with things like monopoly, deficient corporate governance, economists call broadly rent-seeking activities, activities that are not associated with making the economy more productive, but associated with trying to get a larger share of the economy's resources. If that's where wealth, the way people become more wealthy, then of course it's not contributing to economic growth. We're used to thinking of the oil sheikdoms, the oil countries, as rent-seeking economies. And there's a phenomenon widely studied in economics of what's called the natural resource curse. Countries with a lot of resources tend not to do very well. And the reason is very simple, that people within those countries fight over who gets the resources, and as a result of that fighting, actually the amount of resources gets smaller. And countries like Switzerland, who have no resources, can't fight over that. They have to create wealth if they're going to grow. And the same thing about Scandinavian countries. So the basic idea is that this concept of rent-seeking, we think of that as these oil countries, but actually the United States has become, and many other countries, have become very large rent-seeking economies. And the financial sector sort of epitomizes some of that rent-seeking activity. They put an enormous amount of resources in moving money from the bottom of the economic pyramid to the top. And in that process, the economy got weaker. So that's, by eliminating that rent-seeking, you would obviously make the economy stronger. The second way in which inequality has a very serious adverse effect on the economy has to do with the inequality of opportunity that I described before. When you have inequality of opportunity, what it means is that those at the bottom who are unlucky in choosing their parents are not going to live up to their potential. They won't get the education, they won't get the opportunities that they otherwise would have had. And that means societies where there's a lot of inequality of opportunity are wasting one of their most valuable resources, their human resources. And of course, you're not going to do well economically if you waste these human resources. The third is that, and this is particularly important for developing countries, but important for all countries, is that economic growth, successful economic growth, requires a lot of public investment in infrastructure, education, technology, lots of things that are necessary for economies today to function well have to be provided by the public in one way or another. But when you have a very divided society, it's very difficult to get the social cohesion necessary to generate support for those public investments. And you see that very clearly in the United States. Although when I talk about infrastructure, in India, I always feel, I mean, most countries I could talk about the United States and feel they can understand how bad the United States is. But India maybe is not the right comparison. Anyway, if you compare some of the European countries with America, going from Kennedy Airport in New York into the city, you understand what I mean about bad infrastructure. And there's a large cost to bad infrastructure, people spending time that could be productively spent in transportation. I mean, there's a real social cost to this. But when you have a lot of inequality, those who have political power worry that too strong a government might use those powers to ask the top to pay their fair share of taxes. And they'd rather have a small government. And so, again, to go back to America's recent election, one of the candidates paid only 14% of his income in taxes, and kept his money in Cayman Islands. And, you know, it wasn't there because money grows faster there because of the sunshine. It's there for reasons of tax evasion, regulatory evasion, but it's not making the American economy grow better. The real point is, people who were working for a living, innovators, researchers, people who work for the government, you know, all sorts of people who really work for a living pay much higher taxes than these people. In the United States, and this is another example of the way our economy is distorted by inequality. The people, our tax code says that speculators that make our economy more unstable pay a much lower rate of taxation than ordinary business people. And you can ask, why would a society decide it wants to encourage speculation rather than hard work, people working for a living, real innovation? Well, it's obvious. It's a reflection of political power in the society. The fourth reason that inequality is bad for the economy is that it's associated with instability. It's not just an accident that in the period in the United States running up to the Great Depression, inequality increased enormously. And in the period leading up to the Great Recession in 2008, inequality increased enormously. There's a simple macroeconomic theory that explains what happens when people at the top don't spend as much money, fraction of their income, as people at the bottom who spend more of their income. In fact, in the United States, the bottom 80% of Americans were remarkably spending 110% of their income. Now, you don't have to have a PhD to understand that that's not sustainable, and that was a recipe for disaster. But the good news was that by spending a lot, they kept the economy going. But when you have all this, and this goes back to the source of the problem, as the economy got more unequal, demand got low, and rather than fixing the underlying problem, the way the government responded, the Fed responded, was said, let's create a bubble and make people feel better off. So even though their incomes were going down, they could feel good because their house prices were going up temporarily. And now, of course, their wealth is down to the level, the median wealth in the United States is back to the level it was in the beginning of the 90s. Almost 2 decades of stagnation in wealth. All the wealth, increase in wealth, there's been a lot, but has gone to, in 2 decades, has gone to the top. Even the IMF now recognizes that inequality is a problem. Strauss-Kahn, when he was the managing director, said, based on research at the IMF, that there is a clear association between inequality and instability. And he went on to say that because stability, economic stability, is the mandate of the IMF has to now be concerned with equality. So it is now becoming a serious macroeconomic issue. Well, let me, from the diagnosis that I gave before, I think a lot of the prescriptions of what one needs to do about addressing inequality are pretty clear, and I won't go go over them. What I want to spend the last few minutes is a question I always get asked in the United States. Is there hope? Or are we caught, mired in an inevitable nexus between more economic inequality leading to more political inequality leading to more economic inequality? Well, let me end on two notes of hope. My publisher said you should always end on an upbeat note. I wrote a few years ago a book called The $3 Trillion War, The True Cost of the Iraq Conflict. And it had a lot of impact on economic, it had a lot of impact on attitudes towards the war, because Americans hadn't realized how expensive the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War were. When Bush went to war, he said, his team said it was going to cost $60 billion. That was the amount we were spending every 2 months. And the total now of the bill is clearly bigger than we said at the time we wrote the book. But one of the problems was, while it had a lot of influence on policy, nobody wanted to buy the book because it was so depressing. So I want to end on a little bit of a positive note. One positive note is that in the United States, inequality has been at a very high levels, roughly comparable to where they are today. At the end of the 19th century, what was called the Gilded Age, and in the 1920s, the Roaring '20s. And both of those episodes were followed by major social and economic legislation to reverse the trend. So the Gilded Age was followed by the Progressive Era. The 20s was followed by the important New Deal legislation, social and economic legislation, that led to a reduction in inequality. And after World War II, this is an important point, the United States grew at the most rapid rate that it's ever grown, and it grew together. Inequality got reduced, everybody grew, but those at the bottom grew more. And so the economy grew faster than it did since the 1980s, where we did all this kind of deregulation, lowered taxes, and do all these things. Growth slowed after 1980, and the economy grew apart. So one of the reasons for writing the book was to try to help people understand that actually we can have more growth and more equality if we put in place the right policies, and that would be good for our society. The second example that gives me a little hope comes from emerging markets, developing countries. I said before that the way economic forces are playing out are not the same everywhere. Inequality is larger in the United States. Inequality of opportunity is greater in the United States. There's less equality of opportunity. In most countries around the world, inequality has been growing. But in several of the Latin American countries, inequality has been coming down. And equality of opportunity has been going up. They put in place, say in Brazil, in the beginning of the 1990s, strong education policies under Enrique Cardoso, and then under Lula, they put in a whole variety of policies aimed at making sure that children got food, that children go into school, that they got access to health. And the remarkable thing is, in a relatively short period of time, this is beginning to show up in the macroeconomic data. So the standard measures of inequality are coming down, and equality of opportunity is going up. And one interpretation of what happened in Brazil was that they looked over the precipice. They saw where their society was going, the dangers of a divided society, and they said, that's not where we want to go. And there was a social consensus from the top to the bottom not everybody, but a broad consensus that they had to bring down the level of inequality, and that there were instruments and mechanisms by which they could do it, and they have succeeded. They still have a high level of inequality. They still have a long way to go, but at least they bucked the trend. The forces, the economic forces, some of which are related to globalization, and they have succeeded in making significant inroads in the problems of inequality which confronted them. And so the big lesson, I think, for India and for many other countries is that these issues are matters of choice. They're not inevitable. The level of inequality is not inevitable. And that I focused too much of my talk, I think, on inequality at the top. But every aspect of inequality should be a focus of discussion. The inequality at the top, the lack of opportunity, poverty at the bottom, and the howling out of the middle class. And all of these are what ought to be a focus of attention for policymakers in India, in the United States, and around the world. Thank you.
Good. Well, how do you follow Joe Stiglitz is the question. Always very difficult, particularly difficult for me because Joe is my teacher. I learned my economics from him. So whenever I speak after him, I'm always going to expect the grade to be given at the end of it, or the term paper is marked. So what I thought I would do is talk about growth and inequality through a series of case studies from around the world. To give some concrete examples. And the basic theme that I want to develop through these examples is that if there are structural inequalities in a society and in an economy, then the growth process is very likely to be disequalizing and unequal. And the way to address this is to tackle those structural inequalities and also to tackle the consequences of those structural inequalities. So that's the broad theme. And this is the theme that was part of an Asian Development Bank report, which I co-authored, called Confronting Rising Inequality in Asia. You can go to the Asian Development Bank website and you can download that report, Confronting Rising Inequality in Asia. So let me give 4 or 5 country examples from around the world about this theme about structural inequalities and the growth process and its impact on inequality. Let me start with East Asia, and Robert Wade here is the expert on that, but if we take, say, Korea and Taiwan, and we look at the start of their process, essentially they started with a land reform which equalized the distribution of land, essentially imposed on them by the occupying forces. So in fact, when they started their modern growth process in the 60s, they had a very equal land distribution to start with. Now, I'm not suggesting, therefore, that what one should do is to be colonized by Japan, and then Japan loses the war, and then the occupying forces redistribute the land because they want to take land away from the Japanese landowners. The main point is that initial conditions matter in the society. And the second thing is that going back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, these two countries, because of their education policies, started the 50s and 60s with a very equal distribution of basic education. So for these two types of structural inequalities, we're actually relatively equal in those two societies. And that, interacting with the growth path that they followed, led in the 60s and 70s to what we now term the East Asian growth with equity miracle. It's one of the cases in history where there has been fast growth and declining inequality in the society. So there's a case study. I'm going to do very thumbnail sketches, obviously, because one can go into a lot of detail on these things. The second case study that I want to take up is the case study of China over the last 30 years or so. And again, you're very familiar with the story that Chinese inequality has, in fact, increased dramatically over the last 30 years or so. And indeed, this was one of the motivating factors for the Asian Development Bank report. Not just China, but India, but many Asian countries, inequality has been rising. But actually, the Chinese story, if you look inside those 30 years, is quite subtle and nuanced. And the periods are quite important. Well, the first 10, 12, 15 years or so, from 1978 onwards, when the Chinese reform process started, actually inequality in China fell because the focus was on the agricultural sector. Through the household responsibility system, farm output increased as peasants were allowed to keep the output that they produced. And as a result of this, rural-urban gaps actually diminished and measured inequality fell. So, strangely enough, in the first dozen or so years of the Chinese reform process, inequality actually fell. It was in the second half of that process when China opened out to the world, when the export-oriented strategy was followed, that in fact sharp inequalities began to appear, particularly between the coastal areas and the inland areas. Okay? And this is the real period of fast increase of Chinese inequality. Okay? So the structural inequality to do with infrastructure differences between the coastal areas and the inland areas, and so on, and the easier access that the coastal areas had, fueled a rise in inequality during a very high growth process. In the last 5 to 7 years, it can probably be said that Chinese inequality is not declining, but it is increasing at a slower rate. The rate of increase is moderating in China. Why is that? It's because the Chinese authorities realized that this was a growing problem in their society. And under the label of harmonious society and so on, the general meeting of the Communist Party, you can read all the documents. They started a program of heavy investment, heavy infrastructure investment in the inland areas, the westward strategy, so to speak. And there's a lot of discussion about what actually is causing this slowdown in inequality rise, but certainly that is one aspect of it. Okay? So this 30-year period of China is actually quite a subtle, nuanced, differentiated process, which tells us the relationship between structural inequalities and the growth process and inequality. Let me take my third case study, which is South Africa. In 1994, before 1994, of course you all know, South Africa was under the apartheid regime. Huge inequalities between blacks and whites, and in particular, huge inequalities in terms of spatial segregation. The blacks were all forced to live in certain areas, and actually the industry and work was all in other areas. So they had long commutes from where they were forced to live and where the industry, etc., was. And on top of that, tremendous inequalities in terms of education, healthcare, sanitation, electricity, all that sort of stuff, as between the black areas and the white areas. So in 1994, when the apartheid regime fell, the question is, how was South Africa going to develop? And what has actually happened in the last 20 years? 2014 will be the 20th anniversary, actually, of the fall of apartheid. So all these sorts of evaluations are now taking place. In fact, two things have happened. Firstly, the inequalities in health, sanitation, education, etc., have actually narrowed. There has been a purposive investment by the government in education for blacks, in health facilities, and so on. So the statistics are showing an improvement and a narrowing of the gaps. However, income inequality and employment issues still remain a huge problem. Income inequality has been increasing, it has actually not come down, and unemployment is at astronomical rates. I mean, measured unemployment is of the order of 40% and so on in South Africa, depending on how exactly you measure it. So here we have two things. On the one hand, the government is indeed trying to address certain types of structural inequalities. But one aspect of the structural inequality, which is the spatial segregation, which is related to employment problems in South Africa, has not been addressed and cannot be addressed very quickly. There is still the issue of commuting long distances from the townships to where the work is. Okay? So this structural inequality is going to take longer time to address. And one consequence, there are many other reasons why this is happening, but one consequence of this is that income inequality in South Africa remains very high, unemployment remains very high, although on social indicators there has been a narrowing of gaps. Let me take my fourth case study, which is another country in Africa, Ghana. Ghana is a country in West Africa, and a key divide in Ghana is between the south and the north. in that part of West Africa, the south of the country, actually south of any country in that part of West Africa, it falls into the coastal or the forest agroecological zone. And the northern parts of the country fall into the savanna zone, going into the sort of Sahel desert type area. That is a structural divide in the country. Okay? Export crops like cocoa are grown in the south of the country. They are not grown, they cannot be grown in the north of the country. Okay? So when you liberalize and exports increase, okay, it will benefit the south of the country relative to the north of the country. So Ghana has had a remarkable growth performance over the last 15 years. Okay. Its measured poverty rates have fallen nationally. But the gap between the north and the south has widened. Okay? And all I need to tell you is that the north, like most countries in that part of West Africa, the north of the country is Islamic, and the south of the country is Christian. That all I need to say is that for you to understand what an explosive process this is. All the numbers look good, okay? The growth rates look good, the poverty measures are coming down. So, but unless you look at it through the inequality lens, you will not be alerted to issues that are arising in this context. And to their credit, Ghanaian policymakers and politicians are well aware of this and are indeed investing in the north and so on. One of the things that's very remarkable is that the neighboring country, the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, has had a major civil war between the north of the country and the south, precisely between the north of the country and the south of the country. They're just coming out of it now. But Ghana has not. And an interesting question is why? And the answer is because Ghanaian politicians are well aware of the consequences of this divide and well aware of what the growth process is doing to that divide. And they're actually investing to maintain that balance. The final case study that I want to mention, and I won't take very much time over it because Joe has already alluded to it, is in fact Latin America. And as Joe mentioned, Latin America, the measured levels of inequality are high relative to Asia. Okay? But in Asia, inequality levels have been rising, and in Latin America, they've been coming down. In fact, this was the hook that we used in our Asian Development Bank report to confront Asian policymakers, to say that East Asia in particular is no longer the home of growth with equity. It is actually the home of rising inequity. Whereas Latin America, which 25 years ago, 30 years ago, we always said, oh, they're very unequal. They're still very unequal, but in fact, they're coming down. Why? How have they done it? And the answer, again, is that they have addressed structural inequalities in their society. A key structural inequality in Latin America, because it's Brazil and Mexico, so there's a highly urbanized societies. So the rural-urban divide is not as big an issue in those countries. The real issue are income differentials within urban areas related to education differences. Okay? And so they have, as many of you know, they have instituted widespread programs of conditional cash transfers, transferring cash in return for children remaining in school and so on. And this conditional cash transfer does two things. Firstly, it's a transfer of cash to those at the lower end of the distribution. It's a straightforward redistribution. But secondly, it is targeted towards addressing a structural inequality, namely inequality in human capital in education. Okay? And all the numbers show this thing very clearly, that it's as a consequence of this, as one consequence of this, that inequality in Latin America has been coming down over the last 20 years. So there you are. Those are 5 case studies. East Asia, lucky to start with a. No, we can. Let's wait for the discussion. Let's wait for the discussion. Joe can talk a lot about Russia, by the way. I can also, but we can. Let's stick to this thing for now. So just to summarize, East Asia, lucky enough, quote unquote, to start with a land reform imposed on them, but also through policy building up an equal distribution of education. China, when agriculture was supported from the policy point of view, declining inequality. When investment was turned towards the inland provinces, inequality is held in check. When those things are not done, inequality rises. South Africa, attacking one aspect of structural inequality, namely education, health, etc., but another aspect, to do with employment and income inequality, is still to be addressed. In Ghana, The key difference is a regional difference between north and south. Everything really centers around that, and unless that is managed, no matter what the other macro statistics tell you, this country is going to be in trouble. And Latin America has turned around the image of Latin America as being a high inequality country because purposively they have addressed and attacked structural inequalities in their societies through redistributive measures. The lesson, therefore, I conclude with how I started, is that if there are structural inequalities in a society, the growth process is very likely to be unequal and disequalizing. If we don't like that, the way to address it is to address the structural inequalities directly. But since addressing structural inequalities will take a longish time, that you can't just be done overnight, we also have to attack inequality directly through redistribution of resources. Thank you very much.
Is this on? Yes. I'd like to come back to the question of what mainstream economists, excluding those present, should learn or should have learned from the great Western financial crash and the ensuing long slump. I think that the discipline of economics, mainstream economics, has suffered a fundamental betrayal, has betrayed the trust placed in it by the public. Economics is the most influential of the social science disciplines in public policy. And if you look at what mainstream economists were saying about the Western macroeconomy over the 2000s, it is just spectacular to see how wrong they were. Let me just give two examples. For example, in April 2006, Anne Kruger, who was then the deputy managing director of the IMF, announced the IMF's view that the, quote, the world economy has rarely been in better shape. The world economy has rarely been in better shape. And then in May 2007, the chief economist of the OECD, Jean-Philippe Cotis, announced the OECD's view, remember this is May 2007, that, quote, the current economic situation is in many ways better than what we have experienced in years. Our central forecast remains benign. We expect the OECD to show strong job creation and falling unemployment. Well, you couldn't be much more wrong than that. And so what I want to talk about, first of all, is what economists should learn about inequality and the link between inequality and financial instability. This is really to elaborate on some points that Joe has already made. And I want to begin by just giving some examples, more quotes from economists, explaining why inequality was a question which was quite unimportant for economists at any rate. And begin with my former colleague at the London School of Economics, Willem Buiter, who said, and this is 2007, in the Financial Times, poverty bothers me, inequality does not. I just don't care. End of quote. He's now the chief economist of Citigroup in New York, by the way.